Hello there, I'm Ryan, and welcome to Analyze This, Mr. Bond, my channel where I discuss the adventures of fictional super spy James Bond 007 to dig for what lies beneath the surface. And today we're undertaking a thought exercise, and this thought exercise is very familiar to Bond fans. This thought exercise is, what should the next Bond film be? What should it look like? How should it reinvent 007? And in taking this thought exercise about the future, it actually illuminates the past and illuminates the character himself. Who is James Bond? What is essential to the character? What elements of the character haven't been explored in great detail? I think there are 3 films in the series that successfully reinvented the character, and those are Live and Let Die, GoldenEye, and Casino Royale. You'll notice I didn't mention On Her Majesty's Secret Service and Living Daylights. Despite the fact that I love those films dearly, they were not cultural events in the way that the films Live and Let Die, GoldenEye, and Casino Royale were. Those films each achieved 3 things. They were very contemporary. They reestablished Bond for a contemporary time period and made sure that Bond felt very clearly established in the bounds of that time period and setting. They were established for a new, younger audience in that way. You know, the target of a new Bond film is only partially the established audience. It's also about establishing a new audience. And in many ways, those films did that. They reestablished the character and captured a younger set of viewers. In many ways, the next Bond we have is the Bond for a new generation. And that's important to think about. They gave Bond a new narrative context in which to exist. And the benefit of giving him a narrative context that's unusual and unexpected is that it shines a light on the nature of the character, because you're seeing him respond to situations the character has not yet been in before. Live and Let Die is very much a fish out of water story, as we might say, or a Bond out of water story. It's very much putting Bond into the frames of both a different film genre, the blaxploitation genre that was popular at the time, and with that came a very different setting for the character. We're witnessing Bond navigate a world he does not know very well. That's one of the more interesting facets of Live and Let Die, is this sort of cultural clash. And GoldenEye, again, comes at that same kind of principle from a different vantage point. It's about Bond being in the mid-90s. The Cold War's over. Bond's a relic. How is he going to establish himself again? And then Casino Royale finds a very different pathway into the same element, but it's Bond at the beginning of his career. What does a Bond who is not fully formed look like? How does he respond to these situations? What does that tell us about this character and how he operates? And in many ways, that's why Casino Royale is such a strong character study, is we're watching the character form in real time before our eyes. So all 3 of those movies are very much both very contemporary, and they find very clear, tangible narrative contexts that help emphasize who the character is. And so both of those ideas together help, establish the character. And then third and finally, those movies distinguish with a difference, which is to say they make very clear breaks with the era that's come before. There's night and day between Connery and Roger Moore's Bond, and the Live and Let Die goes out of its way to avoid comparisons. He's not wearing the tuxedo, he doesn't order vodka martinis, he's not smoking cigarettes, he's smoking cigars. Brosnan's Bond leans into the glamour that was lost during the Dalton years. We take it for granted now that Bond drives a vintage Aston Martin DB5. That's been a staple of the series now for, decades. But at the time of GoldenEye's release, that was a new idea. Bond hadn't driven an Aston Martin, the Aston Martin DB5 since Goldfinger and Thunderball. So that was that seeing that again was the first time the series had really retroactively looked back. I mean, Bond obviously drove an Aston Martin in The Living Daylights in a very notable sequence, but this idea of nodding back to the past and reclaiming that 1960s glamour was very much an intentional statement for reestablishing the character and differentiating Brosnan's Bond, who was very much a return to the core principles of the character sort of statement that distinguished Brosnan from Dalton's Bond, who had left off in License to Kill, and License to Kill was a very untraditional Bond film in a lot of ways. And then, of course, Casino Royale coming after the Brosnan era, and most directly Die Another Day. I mean, you don't need me to expound about the gulf between those eras. And so, if you do all three of those things, you've got a good recipe for success for how Bond should enter the new era. So let's assume that Bond is contemporary. I think Bond will be contemporary. I think Bond should be contemporary. I think it's important that the Bond character continues to be established in a contemporary time period, at least as far as the films are concerned. I just don't see a universe in which period pieces can continue to keep that character fresh and alive in the same way that establishing the character in the landscape of 2025 or 2026 would feel. But the thing about doing that, and we have to really face facts about how that will shift the nature of the character a little bit, is that means the character would have probably been born in the late 80s or early 1990s, depending on the age of the actor they cast. And that's a pretty dramatic shift, because what it says about this character, their sense of the world, their sense of Britain's place in the world, is that it creates a very different perspective for the character. This character, in many ways, like the nostalgia that seeps into the character during the Brosnan and Craig years, this sort of retrospective facet of the character, makes less sense. And embracing that helps keep the character fresh, I think, a little bit here. So I would recommend that the films accept that as a starting point and lean into other ways in which to establish why this character is the way he is. I think one facet of the character that has always been underexplored in the films and in many of the original novels, I mean, some of the continuation novels explored this well, is Bond's naval background. If you accept that Bond is not just a commando, which is kind of how the Craig era emphasizes his background, but is a true naval officer who's traveled the world, who is very worldly, who traveled the world as a naval officer and then continued in his early years in the espionage business, you get a sense for why this character might be the way he is. He's grown accustomed to the feeling of a uniform and being empowered by a uniform. It's not a suit that he wears with disdain. It's something he wears because it bolsters who he is. You know, and so if we lean into this idea of a worldly Bond who's traveled the world and who has sampled so much of what it has to offer, and that has actually fueled his appetite for life, I think right there you already get a very strong differentiation from the Craig era in particular, where it didn't seem like Bond's joie de vivre, his lust for life was very strongly in evidence. If we lean into that a little bit and then couple that with this sense that this Bond is a true naval officer, is a true professional who's used to taking orders, who's used to, in many cases, giving orders, and understands chain of command, and has, connections with the Royal Navy. I think that's an interesting road to start exploring with this version of the character, and helps kind of backdoor your way into some of those um, Bond origin elements without having to really properly retell an origin story. Um, there was an unfinished Fleming story. I think he had some ideas in a notebook about a Greek character named Zographos who had taught Bond how to play cards. And I think like those kind of characters, Bond having friends across the world is something that has been missing from the series since Craig joined the series. And it would be great to see Bond have a strong network of friends across the world and understand little pieces of Bond's history from Bond reuniting with these figures. I think that's something that the Brosnan era did in a very like light way, and if you did it very purposefully with the new Bond, I think it opens up a lot of interesting avenues to explore the character without doing very dramatic, this time it's personal character arcs where Bond is always like going rogue or things like that. I mean, I think that's a very, you know, a very organic model to build on, especially as you maybe have him travel and, you know, you can have the classic tropes of like friends who betray him and vice versa and things like that, but it's all like kind of embedded into this sense of the worldliness of this Bond, and this Bond who is also a bit of an expert. I mean, we've lost this sense of the Bond who is truly like a bit of a savant, right? Connery's Bond is giving lectures about brandy, and that sort of arrogance is great. And then you get Roger Moore exaggerating that sort of know-it-all aspect to like way out there to the point where he's, you know, arguing with Q about the flowers in South America in Moonraker. We don't need Bond to be, you know, an absurd know-it-all, but I think this idea of Bond being very cultured and knowledgeable and able to pinpoint specific details about the world around him and speak to it with authority is great. In my recent rewatch of the Brosnan movies, one of the things that comes up is, you know, him calling Xenia out on the counterfeit license plate on her car, and like Bond having that sort of worldly knowledge of how things work and allowing that to inform his investigative duties, I think is something really worth leaning into in this new incarnation of Bond. It's an aspect that's been missing for a while, and if you do it in a very intelligent way, not just like a very comedic way in how it was done in the Connery and Moore and Lazenby eras, you can end up with a very intelligent version of the character, and I think intelligence is something that I would really like to see them play with more in Bond 26 too. The character has, you know, has always generally been a fairly smart and capable character, but different versions of the character lean into that a little bit more. I would say Dalton's Bond seemed particularly intellectual. I mean, he knows about Stradivarius and things like that. And that's part of it. We've talked about like knowledge and worldliness, and that's part of it. But I would like to see a return to a sort of articulate verbal intelligence and wit. A very clear sense for being able to get the better of people he's with. I think that was one of the stronger points of Roger Moore's Bond, is that he was always able to confront the villains and position himself as the smartest person in the room just by saying the right thing at the right time. And that's an element that I don't think even the Brosnan era succeeded at very well. So it's been an element that's been somewhat dormant since the Roger Moore years. And I would really love to see very clever, articulate banter and wordplay return to this Bond in combination with his worldliness, in combination with his sense of naval professionalism. And if you start to lean into all those things together, you're starting to get a version of the character that feels fairly different from what came before, but also feels very much in line with the classic archetype of the character. It just starts to frame it in a way that feels appropriate for the time we're at now. I mean, travel is at once more accessible and more of a focal point than it's ever been before. Everybody's looking at Instagram all the time, and everybody's travel pictures. All of our friends, when they take a vacation, we're living it vicariously with them. It makes sense that this Bond should not feel constrained by the boundaries of Britain, and Bond never did in the Fleming novels either. He was always traveling. He was always interested and very acutely observational about other cultures. And I think that's the piece that I want to talk about too with setting. One thing that's been missing from the series for quite a long time is this idea of Bond really being immersed in culture. And I don't know that the series has really leaned into this in a way that is truly significant, probably since the 1970s. Because what happened with the Bond films was they became so interested in globe-trotting that they never stayed in one place long enough to really understand that location as a culture. And I think there's a lot to be said for depth, not breadth, when it comes to locations for Bond films going forward, for really picking a geographical area and building your Bond film around the particularities of that area and its culture. Especially with, some eye to the geopolitical climate. I think, the Bond films have always been a little bit less directly political than the Fleming novels. The Fleming novels have Bond directly facing off against Russia, whereas in the films, Bond is more often facing off against Spectre and fictional forces, and that's fine, but I would love to see this return to culture in Bond films. Like, how exciting would it be to see Bond really spend most of the movie in modern-day Tokyo, much as he spent so much time in Japan in You Only Live Twice in 1967. The gulf between what Japan was in 1967 and is today is immense. So I think on Instagram at one point I said that this idea could almost be like the Anthony Bourdain Bond. If you've ever watched Anthony Bourdain's various television series and his sort of documentary style where he explores a local culture, he's taking in the food and the music and the architecture and the feeling of an area and crafting a narrative for understanding that place. I think that sort of attitude for Bond, who is a sort of like world traveler of an assassin, is a very exciting way to reframe the character for this new age. A Bond who is hedonistic, a Bond who likes to savor the cultures of every place he visits. I think that's a pretty cool framework to lean into. And once you start to do that, I think you start to stumble on very particular and interesting stories. I think the way stories have often been set up for Bond movies, especially once the Fleming novels stopped being clear material, is like, oh, well, here's this big idea for what the villain might do. Let's graft locations into that. And instead, exploring an area and figuring out what form of villainy might exist in that part of the world actually might come up with some very unique and particular methodologies for Bondian villainy that might not have occurred to us otherwise. And then let's also talk about the shift in the world of espionage right now. We live in a world where there's facial recognition technology. That's radically different for what it means to be a spy in the world. And in some ways, this sort of assassin persona is less useful than ever. It's almost like a very Bond has been described as a blunt instrument, and in an age where increasingly espionage is done through computers, as the past two eras of Bond have continually suggested, going back to Boris and carried through in Q and the Craig era and all that. We have to really think through what it means to be a 00 agent with a license to kill. And I think it could be really fun to reposition MI6 in the new movie and its relationship to the 00 section. Traditionally, M has been the head of MI6, and Bond has been fully embedded into that organization. There's an interesting and underdeveloped idea that sort of starts to come in the movie Spectre, that the 00 program might be like the separate subset of a larger intelligence organization. And it could be a very interesting starting point that helps, again, reframe this character in a new way if the 00 section is really this sort of leftover program that's just been kind of like a top secret, isolated program that's been kind of operating on its own for a very long period of time. It's so secret that most people in MI6 don't even know about it. And it's more like a slightly tactical sub-team that's been continuing to operate, but, funding has been dwindling over the years. We're seeing it operate more and more in a sort of like scrappy fashion. Perhaps, Q in this new version of Bond is less about giving Bond cutting edge equipment and more about making the equipment that they have work in this time and place. He's less, he's not giving you the latest AI powered nanobot, blood, but is actually maybe, like retooling some classic items from the 1980s that the rest of the world isn't paying attention to, but like good old-fashioned spycraft. And I think that spycraft is something that's been really missing from Bond for a while. I miss this idea of Bond being a true spy professional. Like, how long has it been since we've seen Bond go into a hotel room and sweep his room for bugs? Too long. I think that's the kind of thing that I really want to see more of, is like, as we talk about Bond being a professional, is like this Bond who really is leaning in to spycraft and the particulars of it. And that spycraft is kind of a day-to-day grind a little bit, right? Bond has always been, in the classic iteration, like kind of like a brute force detective who's sent to investigate pretty messy situations in the world and figure out what's going on there. And he's always traditionally employed a lot of spycraft in doing so. In the Craig eras, I mean, he's pretty much dispensed with code names. He's just a wrecking ball of a human being. I think getting back to the intelligence of espionage work and getting back to gadgetry, not in the sense of just gimmickry. We don't need, a grappling hook from his watch like Brosnan had, as much as that's fun, as much as it's just cool to see very pragmatic, practical spy equipment utilized well and utilized thoughtfully, I think helps set up who this Bond could be in 2023. So a lot of these are just little shifts in emphasis. Nothing here is too terribly high concept beyond perhaps the way I'm suggesting they reframe MI6 into the 00 section and Q. But I think a lot of these little shifts add up to a big sense of difference. Much as, GoldenEye and Live and Let Die were not like radical, burn it all down resets, but still shifted enough little things that Bond felt like a new character again. I really think, like, say you were to do a Bond 26 where Bond is this younger former naval officer who is traveling to Japan for the first time since he visited it early in his career to investigate some important critical goings on behalf of a, funding strapped MI6, funding strapped 00 section that is kind of like operating secretly within the boundaries of MI6 as this sort of like shadow force. You end up with a fairly like distinct foundation for how this character might evolve and play out in the film that feels fairly different from what we would have received in the Daniel Craig era or even in the Pierce Brosnan era. And that just illustrates how if you make enough little calibration changes, you don't have to make a huge, enormous pivot. We don't need another huge, high-concept Bond origin story where, he loses the love of his life again and, figures out who he is again. We don't need that sort of huge, dramatic arc in order to reestablish the character. In many ways, you just need a very concrete sense of the character, his world, and his place in it. And that's what this video has been about. If I'm going to sum anything up about this video, it's that to reestablish the character, it's about paying attention to detail and being very thoughtful about what you're doing and how you're carrying the character forward. There are many different paths Bond 26 could go down. These paths are kind of like my personal preference. You pull me into the writer's room, this is how I'm going to try to steer the ship. But I don't run Bond 26, and Lord knows it'll probably be someone like Christopher Nolan who's going to come in and have his big high concept take establish the new era, and I hope it works out well. But I think we need less of a high concept Bond 26 and more of just a very clear, well thought out sense of who this character is, what his world is, and where he comes from and what motivates him. And if they figure those things out, Bond 26 will be in good shape by the time they're ready to start rolling cameras. So let me know your thoughts on this video. Let me know what your thoughts are for Bond 26. What's on your personal Bond 26 wish list? What do you want for the character of Bond? What do you think they should be doing to distinguish the character in the world of 2023? Do you think they should be doing a period piece? If so, why do you think a period piece is bound to be successful and going to set the character up for success for decades to come? I'd love to hear the argument for it. I've yet to be convinced by it, but I'd love to hear the argument. So let me know. I'll be happy to engage with you in the comments. And beyond that, I'll catch you in the next one.